In 1919, 130 hard-working men finished their shifts below ground in a Cornwall tin mine. It was like any other day. They stepped on the machinery that took them to the surface when suddenly an ear-piercing sound was heard above. Before we get into this video, if you're new around here, my name's Ryan from Tragedy Tales, and on this channel, every week, we cover all things tragedy. And in this week's video, we're starting a new series called The Forgotten UK Tragedies, where we take a look at some of the UK's most forgotten accidents to pay tribute to those who lost their lives so that they're never truly forgotten. So without further ado, this is the horror in Levant Mine. On the 9th of November 1918, the Central Powers that fueled the First World War began to collapse, leading to Kaiser Wilhelm, the last German emperor, abandoning his throne. And on the 11th of November, the new German government signed the armistice, bringing the Great War to an end. British soldiers that had been fighting in the muddy trenches dropped their weapons and returned home. But many soldiers suffered from shell shock or were disabled. It was difficult to get used to normal civilian living and to forget the horrors of the war. Their lives would never be the same again. Training centres were set up to support ex-servicemen and retrain them in new jobs. But in the town of St Just in Cornwall, soldiers that returned home that were fit and healthy were sent into the local mines, named Levant Mine. Levant Mine was constructed in 1820 and quickly became a staple job for many in the surrounding towns. It had around 400 to 600 employees always working there, including men, women and children. The men and the boys as young as 14 would be sent into the mine in the morning. As they'd enter, they'd dip their hands into a pool of clay and attach a candle to their heads for light, while the women and the children would work on the surface preparing ore for sale. The mine spans for around 2,000 feet below ground. Now they used to measure this in fathoms, but we'll be sticking to feet in this video. And what I thought was most interesting is that its mine shaft spanned for over a mile beneath the Atlantic Ocean. As you can imagine, conditions in the mine were terrible. It was muddy, wet and extremely hot. At the lower depths, temperatures verged on a sweltering 40 degrees. Because of this, miners would wear minimal clothing. Most would not even wear boots as they would fill so fast with sweat. As they dig, their candles would be constantly blown out with the draft, so they'd relight them with matches that they'd keep in brass match tins to keep them from getting wet. Ventilation was poor and wobbly ladders were a constant worry for the miners. There were dangers of rock falls and floodings, and there were many reports of miners returning to the surface severely injured or blinded. One of the shafts that stretched out under the ocean was just 40 feet from the seabed, and in bad weather, miners could even hear the treacherous waves above them. A pump would work to constantly pump the water out, reminding them of what danger they would be in if any part of this operation were to fail. Despite all of this, the pay did not reflect the work that they had to do. Due to economic hardships from the Great War, they were barely able to get by on this wage. When it was first built, mining wasn't even the hardest part of the job. After a hard day's work, miners would still have to climb the 1,600 to 2,000 feet distance back to the surface on 80 various ladders. The draft would constantly blow out their candles, meaning they'd have to do this in the pitch black. This took a grueling 1.5 hours to reach the top from the bottom. Deaths and falling injuries were common, as one wrong step would send the miner plummeting down the shaft below. And then when they reached the surface, the men would then have to trek several miles to their hometowns to get home. The days were hell. However, in 1857, much to the miners' happiness, a newly invented contraption was installed in the mine, intended to assist the miners on their shift. They called it the man engine. The man engine was essentially a big, early steam engine, linked to a series of beams known as rods, bolted together, reaching all the way to the bottom of the mine shaft. It has a series of steps, 12 feet apart, attached to a main rod. Each worker would get onto their step, travel down 12 feet, they would then get off and wait on the platform for it to reset. The routine was dreadfully monotonous. You'd get off and on until you reached the sunlight above. The vast mechanics of this man engine spanned 180 feet across in an engine room on the surface, starting up at 6:30 every morning. With this in place, it was now possible for 130 men to descend or ascend at the same time. making the mine that little bit less strenuous. It was seen as a miracle of technology, and it cut the time to get to the surface to just 30 minutes. 62 years later, in 1919, the mine still sat perched on the cliffs, with the man engine still in place, running ever since. On Monday, the 20th of October, 1919, a 29-year-old man named William Murley woke up for his shift in the mine. He had 3 kids and lived in St. Just, where he was born. He, just like many other boys, followed their fathers straight into the harsh working conditions of the local mine. His pregnant wife, Anita, made him a cooked breakfast and packed his lunch for the tough day ahead. And around 6:30 a.m, he left the house with a smile on his face. He returned home just 5 minutes later to retrieve his matchbox, as he'd forgotten it. Back then, coming back for your matchbox was seen as a bad omen. He grabbed his matchbox and he left. By 1919, the man engine had begun to show signs of wear, as anything would after 62 years of constant usage. The wood that the beams had been bolted onto had rotted terribly, and it creaked and bulged when it was in use. Almost every single miner now feared the reliability of the man engine. Other mines in the area had already been modernised. Even in 1919, it was considered a museum piece. Its poor working condition was reported to management many times, who were aware of its condition, but as always, they just saw the bottom line. They dismissed these complaints and the work continued. Around 7 a.m, William arrived at work. He clayed his candle to his helmet and hopped onto the man engine to begin his descent into the mine, as he did every other day. He reached his position and he stepped off. He dug his pick into the earth. Here they would slog for hours, and after an honest day's work, at around 3 p.m, William, along with 130 other miners, began their journey to the surface. They'd step on, step off, rinse and repeat, as the ancient machinery chugged away, heaving the miners to the surface. Right at the top of the man engine, something finally gave way. The link connecting the 2 parts of the main engine suddenly snapped, and the top 360 feet of the man engine broke away from the rest of the contraption, tumbling down the shaft. And as it fell, it snapped in half, bringing with it the men that were on that portion. As it came down the shaft, it dislodged debris and timber from the infrastructure, obliterating everything in its path. It then came to a lucky, abrupt stop when the rod lodged itself in the shaft, around the 400 feet mark. The rod and the men had tumbled a total of 276 feet. Some of the men on the rod jumped off at the first sign of trouble and watched as it flew past them, but not everyone was so lucky. Some decided to hold on and were dragged down the shaft with the rod. Miners that were lower down the rod felt it shake violently, and then a tremendous crash was heard. While the rod getting stuck actually saved the miners below from falling rocks and timber, it was now the only thing stopping them from reaching the surface. When all the commotion came to an end, the shaft became strangely still. Survivors that were on the rod were now in pitch black. They had no idea what had happened. Anyone who was not buried in the crash relit their candles and got to work getting their friends out of the rubble, despite many of them being injured themselves. Folks on the surface heard that something had gone wrong, but by the time they looked into the hole where the man engine was, it was now an empty, dark shaft. They immediately began to call for help and rescue. By 3:30 p.m, William's wife Anita had his dinner prepared and sat on the table, but he didn't return as he usually would. She thought that perhaps something had broke underground and that they had to walk up, but his dinner soon got cold. 6 p.m. came and went, and William was nowhere to be seen. Back then, they had no phones, and many wives reported that their other halves had not returned from the mine. Anita feared the worst. Back at the mine, it was a complete disaster. After the initial collapse, it was only silence from the shaft. People were calling for ropes and ladders, and the first thing they did was ask for a volunteer to go down and establish how bad it was. One man bravely volunteered, and he quietly lowered himself down the dark ladder. He got to the very last pitch and he slowly held up his lantern. It revealed total horror. Death was all around him. Everywhere he looked, he saw people that were buried or partially buried in rubble. It was just a nightmare. Some were moaning for help, and some had clearly died from the fall. As he looked around, his stomach sank as he began to recognize his friends in the dead. He returned to the surface to relay the grisly news, and they sent for as much help as they possibly could. Pretty soon, Many kind individuals arrived from the surrounding towns and mines. They worked to assist anyone buried at the 400-meter mark and to try and see if they could do anything to help the miners trapped below. The men, including many miners of Levant, worked as hard as they possibly could, but they were facing a mammoth task. Almost every time they would move dirt, they would discover another body. They tied the dead and the injured to a rope and extracted them the old way, up a ladder to the surface. There was around 100 men still trapped below the blockage. They began looking for a way to get out, but the blockage was so thick there was no way they were going to get through it. They agreed that their best chance would be to climb from the shaft into the mine, then along the skip shaft and the engine shaft to safety. A very dangerous climb, but they had no choice. They began to make their way up with just the candles on their heads for light. Around 2 hours later, amazingly, the men appeared in the engine room in shock. 12 of them had injuries that were so bad it was unlikely that they would ever work again. One of the miners who were on the rod when it broke above him slipped down the mine shaft and his candle was lost. And when he opened his eyes, he too was in complete darkness. He was standing on a step, no more than 18 inches long and around a foot wide. He couldn't move in any direction as he had no idea how far he would fall, and here he held on for as long as he possibly could. He held on for what felt like forever, until suddenly he was relieved to see a candle appear from the darkness. He was saved. For 12 hours, he stood in the pitch black on this tiny little step, in absolute hell. The men that were directly above and below him had died from their injuries, so they were amazed when they found him alive. That night, they counted, and tragically 10 miners had died, but many were still missing. Days of recovery went on, and as the rescue reached Wednesday, groans could still be heard from a man by as late as 2 p.m. But when they finally got to him around 8:30 on Wednesday, he had sadly died. Soon after, they stopped finding any survivors, and their last body was extracted on Sunday morning. Tragically, this brought the death toll to 31. William and his uncle were among the dead. His pregnant wife and kids sat at home that Monday night, hoping for his return till the early hours, but he never did. That following day, the news hit the paper and Anita saw William's name on the list of the dead. But before she even read the news, she knew in the pit of her stomach that he had perished. In the small towns, everyone knew everyone. Almost every family in the area lost a father, a husband or son, a cousin, uncle or brother. It's estimated that it left 75 children without fathers. And in just one family, 11 brothers and sisters became orphans. People were outraged that the mine had endangered and killed their loved ones. And soon after, an official inquiry was started. And after some deliberation, it was ruled that it was an accident. The jury returned the following verdict: that death was accidental, cause being the fatigue in one of the crucial parts of the machine, and they ultimately ruled that no one was to blame, despite the managers knowing full well that the machinery was decrepit. Obviously, a lot of people of Cornwall were unhappy with the verdict, but this was as far as it ever went in court. The mine continued operation, but the lower portion of the shaft was never unclogged, so it was never used again. The NHS and Industrial Injuries went on to issue compensation to the affected families. The locals of Cornwall started a Levant Accident Fund and eventually distributed it evenly amongst the families. But no amount of money could replace the loved ones and families that were destroyed in this disaster. Just 11 years after the incident, in 1930, as tin dropped to an all-time low, the Levant Mine was shut as it was hemorrhaging money. The miners hung up their picks on their very last shift, and eventually they turned off the pumps, flooding the passageways. For years, the mine sat there in silence, an eerie reminder to anyone that saw it of what tragedies unfolded there. In 1967, the mine was given to the National Trust, and in 1992, the steam engine that was powering the man engine was restored. While the shaft is now obviously inaccessible, the engine remains a popular tourist attraction as the world's only Cornish beam engine still operated by steam on its original site. And in 2019, Cornwall marked its 100-year anniversary of the disaster. Descendants of the many families attended a memorial service to pay tribute to the fallen. The names of those who lost their lives were read out, memories were exchanged, and tears were shed. But that was the disaster in Levant Mine. Let me know what you thought of this video in the comments below, but I just think that it's so tragic that so many families were left without fathers, and it's just horrible to think about how many families were destroyed overnight. Now this is just my opinion, but I think it should not have been ruled an accident. They should have maintained or at least upgraded the man engine as time went on, but they just didn't. Life was valued very little in 1919. It was reported to managers, and they did nothing, and the innocent miners had to pay the ultimate price. But that's the end of the video. If you're into true horror such as this, make sure you've tapped that subscribe button, but I will see you in the next one. Bye bye.